This next era is an interesting one, called the law and order politics era, because there was clear times during the early parts of Johnson's administration where he had to use the military, the color of law, and conspiracy provisions to protect African Americans in Selma, Alabama, and Philadelphia, Mississippi. However, I am going to focus on his efforts on episodic law and order, specifically on how law and order politics played out. The first thing you have to understand is what I mean by law and order politics. Law and order politics is generally a public debate, typically between political opponents, about the apparent or actual rise in crime and what could be done to reduce this problem. You win the law and order politics by providing symbolic and substantive solutions that gives the public confidence that you are reducing crime. Lyndon Johnson chose to play law and order politics by selling his War on Poverty initiative as a war on crime. He sold his Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 as an anti-crime initiative. After his re-election, however, Johnson made incredible strides in expanding the president's role in episodic law and order. He passed numerous laws that incentivized local and state police to prevent crime through rehabilitation, job opportunities, and education. The Safe Streets Act, in particular, created a new agency within the Justice Department, the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration. This agency gave state and local police one centralized federal agency to facilitate the federal government's anti-crime policies, and this helped the administration tremendously in prosecuting organized crime. However, while Johnson was signing these laws and implementing them, urban riots emerged in places like Harlem, Watts, and Detroit, all caused by some incident between the police and the black community. In the midst of this chaos, Nixon promised to use his powers as president to be tough on crime. However, Nixon's law and order policies did not differ from Johnson's or Kennedy's. In fact, he signed an extension of Kennedy's Rehabilitation Juvenile Delinquency Bill. He also signed an extension of Johnson's Prisoner Rehabilitation Act and Safe Streets Act. He then proposed and signed his own Juvenile Delinquency Act, which gave health, education, and welfare funding for juvenile delinquency programs outside of the juvenile correctional system. He also created the Office of Juvenile Delinquency within the Johnson-created Law Enforcement Assistance Administration. He also decriminalized running away and truancy, and he required states to reverse their practices of disproportionately arresting and confining minority youth offenders. This is the real difference between law and order politics and law and order policies. If you only go by the rhetoric of a president, or just, you may actually miss their actual policies. And based on the evidence, it appears that Nixon did not have racialized crime policies. He instead had racialized law and order politics. President Carter and Ford focused on organized crime and public corruption, using the federal and state law enforcement apparatus that was expanded by Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. They did not focus too much on using the color of law and conspiracy provisions to protect African Americans. The Reagan era is very critical when looking at the law and order president, because it challenges this very simple story that we have been told, specifically that the war on drugs and racism led to the mass incarceration of African Americans. In reality, for several decades, the president and the federal government had declared a war on organized crime. And in fact, Johnson and Nixon began to give local police military equipment, not to combat street-level drug crime, but to combat organized crime. By the Reagan era, the RICO statute had put organized crime on the defensive, and the media was focused less on it. But now you had a very large law enforcement bureaucracy, heavily staffed and heavily equipped for organized crime, but did not have any particular mission. The war on drugs gave them their mission, as Reagan took the crime rehabilitation programs pushed by Nixon and Johnson and used those resources or redirected those resources to incentivize local police to take on the war on drugs. However, this is not what caused the mass incarceration of African Americans alone. Mass incarceration occurred, I believe, based on the evidence, because as the government focused its attention on the war on drugs, President Reagan and the Justice Department refused to use his authority under the Sections 241 and 242, the color of law and conspiracy provision, to protect African Americans from police misconduct. On the one hand, the police had financial incentive to pursue the war on drugs in black neighborhoods, but more importantly, they knew they would not face federal prosecution for misconduct or racial violence or false imprisonment, all charges previous administrations had used against police officers. In other words, Mass incarceration occurred not because Reagan was maintaining law and order by combating drugs. It happened because Reagan was not maintaining structural law and order and protecting the due process rights of African American citizens. And President Bush and Clinton neglected their responsibility as well to protect African Americans under the color of law and conspiracy provisions, with the notable exception of the Rodney King case. I do not have slides on Bush, Obama, and Trump, as that chapter is currently being worked on, but the early evidence does show that under the Bush, Obama, and Trump years, there is a shift in law and order as they merge national security and immigration with law and order, putting the Department of Homeland Security as the agency now most responsible for carrying out the president's law and order obligations and